Man, there really is just something about a graveyard, isn't there? It's such a peaceful place, one of the greatest places in the world for a quiet, peaceful walk. Of course, for many people, it's a place to go to visit and remember their loved ones that have passed on. But for us horror fans, I think we've got to admit that we are just drawn to the macabre and sometimes gothic atmosphere that these places give us. And of course, it's a great place to set a horror movie. So today we're going to talk about the top 10 graveyard horror films of all time. Welcome to the Cobwebs channel, everyone. My name is Daniel, and yes, these are the movies to watch when you want a fix of that graveyard atmosphere. And I actually went about this list a little bit differently than usual. I actually put it out to you guys to choose the movies. I put out a post in the community tab of this channel and asked you guys, what are the movies you associate the most with graveyards? I picked 10 of those movies that I like, that I want to talk about, and I ranked them not based on movie quality or how much I like them, but on the quantity and quality of the graveyard atmosphere it offers. So let's go ahead and jump in with number 10, which is Frankenstein from 1931. Now, I was born and bred on the Universal monsters. They're the first kind of movies I can remember being obsessed with as a kid. I love them. So of course, I love the original Frankenstein directed by James Whale, the classic story of a man digging up body parts, stitching them together, and bringing his own creation to life. Now, this has got to be on the list because it's one of the top movies that people associate with graveyard horror, but I did put it at the bottom because it's limited to one scene. Now, grave robbing is definitely one of the top things you associate with graveyard horror, and this opening scene has a great example of it, of Dr. Frankenstein and Fritz sneaking out after a funeral has ended and the gravedigger has finished burying the body to then dig it back up. And this is such a stylish and ancient looking graveyard, one that looks like it's very poor with very simple but spooky gravestones like the crooked cross that marks the grave in question. My favorite part of it is this medieval Grim Reaper statue that stands over the graveyard. Oh my gosh, I wish I could see something like that in a graveyard today. So spooky. I mean, the vibes are just immaculate. And of course, this is a phenomenal movie even to this day. Boris Karloff is incredible as the Frankenstein monster. The whole movie just has some of the best spooky atmosphere you will ever see. But for graveyard horror, it's limited to this first scene, but it's still so good. At number 9, Night of the Living Dead from 1968. Yes, this is the original classic from George Romero that, while not being the first zombie movie by any means, really kicked off what the modern zombie genre is. And it's this opening scene that I really think makes that transition. Now, this has got possibly the most iconic graveyard horror scene of all time. They're coming to get you, Barbara.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
It's the opening scene in the graveyard where two siblings are going to visit the grave of their father. The brother's very disrespectful of the whole thing, and he starts making a joke to his sister by trying to scare her.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
His voice kind of sounds like he's doing like a Vincent Price sort of thing, a very classic Vincent Price or Hammer horror, sort of a spooky voice that's got that camp value to it. But what's the actual scariest thing that can happen in a graveyard? It's that a dead body actually starts chasing after you. And that's what happens here. And that's what I think marks the transition between the old classic horror, the campy, they're coming to get you, Barbara, and the visceral, modern, unexplainable horror that is a dead body chasing after you in this opening scene. Now, it's daylight in this graveyard sequence, so it's not the greatest atmosphere you're going to see, but the movie is fantastic. Now, I love old black and white horror movies, but this is one of the only ones that kind of gets under my skin. The scenes of the zombies just coming at you, eating flesh, it's all very unsettling. And you can really see why this movie was such a revolutionary horror film for its time. At number 8 is Mr. Sardonicus from 1961. Now, you might not be familiar with this one, but it's a William Castle movie, who was a big classic horror producer around this time, who did movies like House on Haunted Hill and 13 Ghosts. And this is an interesting one. It's a period piece that takes place a long time ago, and it's about a doctor who is called to the house of an old flame of his who is now married to a very rich man, Mr. Sardonicus, and he comes and finds out that Mr. Sardonicus wants him to do an operation on his face. He's his face is hidden behind this blank mask, and when we inevitably see under the mask, his face has been horribly disfigured by this grotesque grin. I love the makeup here. Mr. Sardonicus looks awesome. The only problem is that his mouth doesn't move when he talks. I don't understand how that works, but it's fantastic looking makeup. Mr. Sardonicus is played by Guy Rolfe, who's great. If you're an 80s horror fan, you probably saw him in Stuart Gordon's film Dolls. But it's really Mr. Sardonicus's backstory where the graveyard horror comes in. Now, there's a lot of talk in this movie about ghouls, who are those that dig up graves and feed on their flesh. And when we get Mr. Sardonicus's backstory, we find out he's been cursed because of certain reasons. He dug up the grave of his father, and this act has been what cursed his face and disfigured him. So this one's got to go a little bit lower because it doesn't have a lot of graveyard horror in it, but the whole movie centers around this graveyard sequence that has cursed him. It's very spooky, and I just love the idea that if you dig up a grave for some kind of a selfish purpose, you will be cursed. The dead will curse you. That's just awesome. The movie is great. I love this movie. It's one of my favorite, like, underrated classic horror films. It's got great atmosphere and just an interesting story that is unpredictable. This isn't a typical vampire movie or something like that. It's something different, and like a lot of William Castle movies, he pops in to engage the audience to break the fourth wall, and that stuff's really fun too. At number 7, Pet Sematary from 1989. Now, this is based on the Stephen King novel about a family who moves into a small town. The dad is the local doctor, and they live next to a very busy road, and their 2-year-old son, Gage, runs out into the road and is tragically killed. The parents, but especially the father, is so overcome with grief that he decides to use the pet cemetery, which is just a short walk from his house, in which the local legend says if you bury someone, they will come back from the dead. Now, this is one of my favorite movies of all time. Definitely one of my favorite movies on this list. I love Pet Sematary. I love the whole atmosphere of it. I love these characters. I mean, Fred Gwynn as Judd, the neighbor who reveals the secrets of the pet cemetery to our protagonist, is just such an endearing and charismatic supporting performance. I just love him in this movie so much. Now, this one's a little, even though the entire movie centers around a cemetery, a cursed cemetery, where if you bury the dead, they will come back, but they don't come back right. Sometimes dead is better. It's a little bit lower because it's not got our typical graveyard atmosphere. You know, at first they're just going to a pet cemetery, which is a spooky place, but definitely different than a normal cemetery, of course. And then it's an Indian burial ground.
This was a burial ground.
Whose burial ground?
Mi'kmaq Indians.
Where they actually go to bury a cat and then Gage. So it's unique, it's different, but I love this movie so much. And sometimes I wonder if this movie, and of course the book that it's based on, have saved any kids' lives, because I've got a 1-year-old son who's running around, and whenever he starts going towards the street, I mean, I think about Pet Sematary. It's such a horrific, visceral sequence where the inciting incident happens, and I wonder if it's just made any parents think twice about certain things and save some kids' lives. I don't know, maybe that's dramatic, but I love this movie. At number 6, Plague of the Zombies from 1968. So this is a classic Hammer horror film in which there is a plague that is ravaging a small Cornish village, and the local doctor enlists the help of his mentor to come in to figure out what's going on. But instead of finding a disease, they find an unexplainable horror of dead people being buried and rising from the dead. So if you notice the year of this movie, 1966, you may be surprised that this does predate Night of the Living Dead. And while Night of the Living Dead deserves so much credit, and I gave it a lot of credit in this very video for kicking off the modern zombie genre, I think Plague of the Zombies deserves a little credit too. Now, it is a voodoo zombie film, as the whole genre was before George Romero changed everything. In story, it's very much like a Dracula ripoff, sort of. There is this spooky squire who rules over the village, who we find out is killing people and then raising them back from the dead, just not as vampires, as zombies for his evil purposes. But the zombies are much more like the modern zombies that we know than pretty much anything else pre-Night of the Living Dead. They look awesome. I think of the two movies, this film has the better zombies. They look so cool with the green. But as far as the atmosphere, a lot of this movie takes place in a graveyard. There's a scene where our two main characters dig up the young doctor doctor's wife, and she rises from the dead coming out of the grave. It's such a spooky sequence. I love it. But the real standout sequence of this movie is where a guy is in a cemetery and a bunch of the zombies are literally rising from the grave, crawling out of the dirt. That is one of my favorite things that I can possibly see in a movie. If your movie shows me zombies crawling out of their graves, digging through the dirt, which actually not very many zombie movies actually show you that, I love it. It's one of the greatest visuals possible, and that scene is awesome in Plague of the Zombies. At number 5, The Premature Burial from 1962. Based on the works of Edgar Allan Poe, this is about a man who has an obsessive fear that one day he will be buried alive. He's terrified that he will get this kind of condition in which his body resembles death while he's not actually dead. He gets buried and then he'll never be able to fight his way out. Now, being buried alive is undoubtedly a horrifying thought, and this character lives in fear of it all the time. It drives him to such lengths that he creates a tomb with multiple different gadgets in it that can get him out. So, fun fact about this movie, this is one of Roger Corman's Edgar Allan Poe films. He directed a bunch of Poe adaptations in the 1960s, but this is the only one that does not star Vincent Price. Every other one has classic horror star Vincent Price. So because of that, this is often the forgotten one. It's starring Ray Milland instead of Price. But it shouldn't be forgotten because it actually is great. It's better than some of the Vincent Price ones. Ray Milland does a great job as this very broken man with this horrifying obsession. It's an extremely macabre movie. I mean, it is just dripping in death-obsessed themes, vibes, atmosphere. I mean, it's just such a spooky movie on that level. Tons of the movie takes place in a graveyard. I mean, he builds this tomb in a graveyard. It's got several romantic strolls through a graveyard with Ray Milland and his new wife, Hazel Court. Hazel Court is another horror legend, so it's cool to see her in this movie. Tombs, grave digging scenes. I mean, this movie's got everything you want. The vibes are out of this world great, and it's just a really good movie for those Edgar Allan Poe themes and ideas. So don't let the absence of Vincent Price stop you. Check this one out if you always skipped it before. At number 4, Phantasm from 1979. Gosh, how to explain this movie? Okay, so I think it's a coming of age film, first and foremost, about a young boy who's being raised by his older brother and also a friend who is the local ice cream man, which is funny. He comes to find that there is, in the mortuary of the local graveyard, there is a tall man there who is doing some very spooky things with dead bodies and possibly killing people. I don't even know where to go from there. This is a movie that I respect so much because it does not commit to a horror subgenre at all. And I always find it interesting when horror movies do that. Like, they're not making a slasher film. It's not a vampire movie. It's not a werewolf movie. It's something extremely imaginative and wholly original. I guess it's like interdimensional beings that are stealing dead bodies for nefarious purposes. You've got the tall man in this who is played by Angus Scrimm in an iconic performance. And he's got these spheres that fly through the air. He's got these tiny little Jawa looking dudes. There's so much weird, bizarre horror in this that I think really adds to the spookiness of it because you can't understand what's going on. But the atmosphere of it is so great. Lots of it takes place at a mortuary in a graveyard. The movie actually opens up with a couple making love out in a graveyard. And the movie's also just so interestingly edited. It's so stylish. Don Coscarelli directs this so well. And I just love how it really works as a coming of age film that really has some very good human moments between the characters, interspersed between the bizarre horror that's going on here. And yeah, it's a great movie. I love Phantasm. It's also got one of the greatest scores of all time and a whole lot of graveyard atmosphere. At number 3, Lucio Fulci's City of the Living Dead from 1980. So this movie opens up in a graveyard with a priest hanging himself there above the graves. And this act supposedly begins to open a gate of hell. And our main characters figure this out and realize they need to find a way to stop this gate from fully opening before All Saints Day, because if they don't, then there will be hell on earth. I'm doing my best to describe a plot in a Lucio Fulci movie, which is kind of a pointless effort. Lucio Fulci is an Italian horror filmmaker that made a lot of movies in the 70s and 80s predominantly, and I love him. This movie is actually part of a Gates of Hell trilogy he did, along with The Beyond and The House by the Cemetery. Well, The House by the Cemetery has cemetery in the title. This is the one that has much more graveyard atmosphere. And it's my favorite movie in the trilogy. It's actually inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, so the town in which it takes place is actually called Dunwich. And while it's not based on any specific Lovecraft work, I think it really nails the feeling of just bizarre, unexplainable horror, with things like maggots flying through the air through the window at people, a woman who sees a horrifying sight and it causes her to spit up all of her guts, and that scene goes on for a long time. This movie just really unsettles you with horrific things you can't possibly explain. It's a lot like Phantasm, actually. The two movies have a bit of vibes in common. But I like the characters in this movie, particularly Christopher George. He's kind of a veteran of exploitation movies around this time, and I always love to see him in movies like this. And it's got a lot of scenes in graveyards. There's also a scene where characters break into this tomb and they go underground to this crypt, and the gate of hell is opening up down there. And when they go down there, and there are all these ancient dead corpses rising from the dead, and the makeup is spectacular with the just rotting, truly ancient dead bodies walking around. I mean, you believe a portal to hell has opened up. Like, Lucio Fulci convinces you that something that crazy is happening because the imagery he's showing you is just so weird and creepy. I love this movie. This is my favorite Fulci film. It's one of my favorite Italian horror films ever made. City of the Living Dead is awesome. If you haven't seen it, check it out because it's a great movie, but also because you get to see a lot of graveyards. Our runner-up is The Return of the Living Dead from 1985. We're getting more and more graveyard as we go. Have you noticed that? And almost this entire movie takes place at a graveyard and at a mortuary. It is a horror comedy, I guess, sort of, that posits it's a little bit of a sequel to Night of the Living Dead, where these two guys accidentally unleash this chemical that just starts making dead things rise from the dead. I love the kind of horror comedy this is because it's a comedy, not that the situation is a joke and not that it skims out on stakes or horror or anything like that, but just because the tone is so much fun and the characters are so wacky and, again, so much fun. This movie is an enormous amount of fun. I love rewatching it every single time. It has incredible practical effects. The zombies in this look amazing, whether it's the dead woman who only half of her is still there moving around, which is a perfect puppet. The tar man is one of the coolest things I've ever seen in a movie. He looks awesome. And just tons of graveyard atmosphere in this movie. And it's also got a sequence where dead bodies burst from the ground, rise from the dead. And it's one of the best versions of that you could possibly see. Plus, you get this group of punks who come to party at the cemetery. It's a very run-down cemetery, by the way, which adds to the spookiness. And you get Linnea Quigley dancing basically naked on a grave. And, you know, if your movie has something like that, you undoubtedly have to be on a list like this, probably at number 2, like Return of the Living Dead is. This movie rules. But at number 1 is Cemetery Man from 1994. This is another Italian horror film. It's directed by Michele Soavi, who also made movies like Stage Fright and The Church. And the movie is about, this is another one, it's very interesting to try to describe what this movie is about, but it's about a guy played by Rupert Everett in a phenomenal performance who works at a cemetery, and his job is not just to care for the cemetery, but to kill the dead bodies that rise from the dead. There's a thing happening in this graveyard where on the 7th night after their death, they rise from the dead and he's got to shoot them in the head. So it is a zombie movie because you got zombies walking around, but the focus is not the zombies. This movie is very much a character piece about this guy, Rupert Everett. And on one hand, it's like a movie where you're watching a guy lose his mind, but I don't even think it's quite that because the movie just exists in its own bizarre reality. This movie is so weird. It's probably the weirdest movie on this list, and that is saying something. Even weirder than Phantasm. Just so many bizarre things happen in this. Now, I think Rupert Everett, like I said, is phenomenal in this movie. And he has this, if this movie has a central plot, it's that he has this obsession with this beautiful woman who comes to the cemetery, falls in love with her, seduces her. This is another movie with a love scene in a graveyard, a pretty phenomenal one. And then for the rest of the movie, he keeps seeing these different like reincarnations of her. and each interaction with the different versions of her go differently. It's so strange. Like I said, this movie exists in its own bizarre reality, and the ending is wild. This is not my favorite movie on the list, but it's gotta top the list for graveyard atmosphere because almost the entire movie takes place in this graveyard. Just the gothic vibes are out of this world. Just all this skeleton stuff. There's a lot of the movie that takes place in an orrery, which is basically a giant room in a graveyard where there's just an overflow of dead bodies thrown in there. So there's just tons of skeletons all around inside this room. Man, it's so cool. You even get this scene with this Grim Reaper monster thing. The vibes are immaculate in Cemetery, man. I can't say enough about how good this movie looks if you want good graveyard atmosphere. And the movie is just super interesting. So if you never seen it, I mean, it'll be a wild experience and I highly recommend checking it out. So that's my list that I put together from the picks that you guys gave me, but what else do you love for graveyard atmosphere? Let me know down in the comments below. And if you want another video like this, check this one out right over here where I talk about my favorite movies for farmland atmosphere. I had a lot of fun making that one. Give a like and a subscribe if you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.